The evening air in Silver Ridge, Colorado, always carried the sharp scent of pine and the crushing weight of isolation. William sat by the grand bay window of his estate, a sweeping structure of stone and glass that overlooked the valley. He was 45 years old, though his face remained unlined, frozen in the permanent, pale perfection of his kind. His hair was the color of fresh winter snow, falling slightly over eyes that had seen centuries pass, without a ripple of true warmth. He was the Vampire King, a sovereign over a hidden realm of shadows and ancient bloodlines. Yet tonight, he felt like nothing more than a ghost anchoring an empty fortress. The vast rooms were filled with imported velvet, marble features, and priceless oil paintings that had gathered dust over decades. Every corner of the house mocked him with its silent, flawless vacuum. William had accumulated wealth, authority, and absolute deference from the local community, who knew him only as a reclusive, eccentric investor. But he had long ago forfeited the only thing that could make the endless passage of time bearable: a genuine connection. He lived in absolute seclusion, eating alone, reading alone, existing in a self-imposed exile from a world that moved too fast for his ancient heart. His staff was composed of ordinary humans who maintained a strict, terrified distance. They performed their duties during daylight hours and departed before sunset, as William had decreed years ago. Emotional barriers were far safer than the bitter sting of exposure or disappointment. Only Juliana had managed to stay in his employment for 3 full years. She was 35, a quiet and intensely efficient woman, from a tiny agricultural town in Nebraska. She had moved to Silver Ridge, seeking steady income to support her family back home, moving through his dark corridors like a shadow, never making a sound, always disappearing before he stepped into a room. On this particular Tuesday evening, William was walking down the sweeping stone staircase, intending to review some land deeds in his study, when a sudden sound arrested his movements. Juliana's voice was drifting from the kitchen. It was muffled, thick, and trembling with an emotion he had never heard her display. William stood perfectly still on the landing, his supernatural senses amplifying the sound. He had no desire to spy on his housekeeper, but his feet refused to move. He caught the unmistakable sound of someone holding back a heavy sob while speaking into a cellular phone. It was a raw mixture of desperation and profound vulnerability that usually surfaced when a human felt completely cornered by circumstances. The words came out in broken fragments, carrying an anguish that penetrated the heavy oak doors, like a quiet plea for help. William had never encountered this side of Juliana. For 3 years, she had been a fixture of the estate, a living machine who kept his surroundings immaculate, prepared his meals, and vanished into the background. But this weeping voice revealed a fully realized human being with deep fears, hidden grief, and a complex life he had never bothered to acknowledge. A sudden, unfamiliar curiosity urged him to step closer to the kitchen door, just enough to catch the distinct words without stepping into the light. He felt an internal pang of intrusive guilt, but his ancient instincts kept him rooted to the floorboards. What he heard next struck him with unexpected force, cutting through the emotional numbness that had protected him for centuries. Juliana's voice rose, desperate and entirely naked in its grief. "I know it sounds completely insane, Beatrice, but I have no other choice," she whispered into the receiver. "I need a boyfriend by tomorrow morning." William felt the cold air inside his chest tighten as he processed the bizarre request. A boyfriend by tomorrow morning. The phrase sounded entirely absurd, almost comical, like a line from a cheap television drama. Yet, there was absolutely nothing humorous about Juliana's broken tone or the way her breath hitched between the syllables. He leaned against the stone framework of the corridor, cloaked in the shadows, listening to her explain the exact nature of her dilemma to her friend. He listened with an intensity he usually reserved for high-stakes financial acquisitions. There was something about this raw human vulnerability that kept him bound to the hallway, unable to walk away or pretend he hadn't heard. For the first time in a century, William was witnessing something completely authentic, an emergency that silver and gold could not easily resolve. The heavy silence of his mansion had never felt so deafening as it did while her voice filled the empty spaces, exposing a level of human warmth he had nearly forgotten existed. He began to wonder how many times Juliana had carried such burdens alone in his house. How many nights had she wept in her small quarters, while he remained locked away in his study, analyzing cold numbers and dead histories. A slow sense of administrative shame crept into his thoughts. Juliana continued her conversation, and each sentence opened a window into a reality he had completely ignored. She explained that her younger sister's wedding was scheduled for the following afternoon in Nebraska, a grand family event that had been planned for nearly a year. The wedding itself was not the source of her terror. Rather, it was the strict cultural expectation her family had placed upon her. It wasn't born out of malice, Juliana insisted through her tears. It was simply tradition. Her family belonged to a traditional rural community, where a 35-year-old woman, arriving without a companion, was viewed as a tragedy, a target for whispered pity and constant, invasive questioning. William tightened his pale fists at the realization, feeling an unexpected flash of irritation toward people he had never met. Juliana went on to explain that her mother was severely ill with a failing heart. The doctors had given her less than 6 months to live. This wedding was likely the very last time the entire family would gather under one roof, and the only thing her mother had requested, with the weak, fragile voice of someone running out of time, was to see Juliana happy and settled with someone who would protect her. The irony was devastating. Juliana had to manufacture a lie about love to provide peace to her dying mother. She had to counter tragedy with a fiction. The phone call began to wind down, her voice dropping to a low whisper as the weight of her embarrassment overtook her panic. She admitted to Beatrice that she had considered every alternative. She had thought about canceling her trip, inventing an urgent work crisis, or simply not showing up, but she couldn't bear to ruin her sister's perfect day or deny her mother that final comfort. She had already asked 2 local acquaintances for the favor, but both had flatly refused, claiming the arrangement was too strange and uncomfortable. Juliana terminated the call after promising her friend she would find a solution, though her voice lacked any real conviction. William heard the soft click of the phone hitting the counter, followed by a sharp, muffled sob she tried to bury in her hands. He remained in the dark corridor for several minutes, evaluating the heavy weight of a choice he hadn't realized he was making. Something fundamental had shifted within him during those few minutes of involuntary listening. William remained motionless as the sound of footsteps echoed from the kitchen. He heard the faucet turn on, the rush of cold water suggesting Juliana was washing her face to erase the physical evidence of her tears before finishing her evening chores. He knew his duty as a master of the house was to retreat to his study, maintain the professional boundary, and let her resolve her personal matters independently. But the invisible pull kept him there, pressing against his chest. For 3 years, this woman had been as constant and unacknowledged as the antique clocks ticking against his walls. He had never asked about her upbringing, her aspirations, or her sorrows. He had seen only the efficient labor that kept his life orderly. Now she was entirely real, burdened by a complex family structure and an emotional crisis that wealth could not easily dissolve. William ran a hand through his snow-white hair, feeling an unusual urgency to halt the sound of her quiet distress. Juliana stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her damp hands on her apron. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but she was visibly fighting to regain her professional composure. She froze instantly upon finding her employer standing in the dimly lit hallway like a marble statue. Their eyes locked, and the atmosphere in the corridor grew thick. Juliana's breath caught in her throat as she realized he had been standing close enough to hear everything. The color left her face, leaving her visibly shaken. William saw the raw panic in her eyes, the specific terror of an employee who had accidentally exposed her private life to a distant, imposing employer. She took a small step backward, her fingers trembling against her apron as she searched for a plausible explanation. William raised a calm, reassuring hand, keeping his movements deliberate to prevent her from fleeing. "You do not need to apologize, Juliana," William said, his voice dropping to a quiet, melodic cadence that lacked its usual cold authority. "It was I who inadvertently overheard your conversation." Juliana blinked, utterly bewildered by this sudden gentleness from a man who had always been a distant fixture of wealth. William leaned slightly against the wall, reducing his imposing height to appear more accessible. He knew the power dynamic between a centuries-old vampire king and a human housekeeper could never be truly balanced, but he wanted to offer her a safe space to speak. Juliana took a deep breath, wiping away a stray tear that escaped her lashes, and looked down at the floorboards as she spoke. In a quiet, unsteady voice, she formally explained the situation. She described her younger sister Clara, who was the youngest of 3 daughters, and the only one currently celebrating a traditional romance. Her parents were old-fashioned agricultural workers, from a small Nebraska town, where the old social codes still governed daily life. In their world, an unmarried woman of her age was viewed as an isolated figure, unprotected against the hardships of the world. She explained that her 2 older sisters were married with children, living lives their mother considered stable and blessed. Juliana, however, had chosen a different path. She had moved to Colorado to secure a high-paying position when her father first fell ill, sending the majority of her earnings home every single month to cover medical bills and support her nieces. She had systematically sacrificed her own personal life for the material survival of her family, working long hours, bypassing social circles, and relinquishing her own youth. Now, with her sister's wedding hours away and her mother's health failing rapidly, she could not bear to arrive alone and become the object of collective pity. It wasn't an issue of vanity, it was emotional survival. She needed to protect her mother from the additional anxiety of leaving her eldest daughter entirely alone in a distant state. William listened to every word, the simplistic image of his quiet housekeeper completely dissolving before him. Juliana finished speaking, and the silence that followed was incredibly heavy. She braced herself for a professional reprimand about keeping personal problems away from the estate, or perhaps a polite, empty expression of sympathy before he dismissed her for the night. Instead, William remained completely silent, his pale features fixed in a look of deep concentration. His dark eyes, typically cold and calculating, held an unexpected warmth that disoriented her. "Is your mother's condition truly that advanced?" William asked gently, breaking the silence with a tone devoid of any corporate coldness. Juliana nodded, her throat tightening again. She explained that her mother suffered from advanced congestive heart failure. The rural physicians had given her less than 6 months. Every family gathering was now treated as a final farewell, making this wedding an irreplaceable milestone. William processed the information, his posture relaxed, his hands resting quietly in his pockets, rather than checking his watch or phone. "And your father will not accept your attendance without a companion?" William asked, framing it as an understanding of her cultural reality rather than a judgment. "It is simply the way he understands the world," Juliana whispered, looking up to meet his gaze. "He believes a woman alone is exposed to every storm. He and my mother told me I was welcome, of course, but they made it clear that arriving alone would cause a great deal of worry. My aunts would spend the entire reception trying to match me with local bachelors out of pity. It would ruin the joy of the day." She had arrived at the desperate conclusion that a temporary, manufactured companion was the only way to grant her mother peace and preserve her own dignity for a single afternoon. But saying it aloud to her wealthy employer made the plan sound incredibly foolish. William remained quiet for several long seconds, his mind working through a calculation that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with a long-buried human instinct. He stood straight, stepping slightly closer to her, with careful, measured movements. "I understand exactly why this matters to you," he murmured, his voice slightly gravelly. "No one should be forced to choose between their family's peace and their own dignity." Juliana looked at him with genuine surprise, her chest rising and falling with quiet emotion. She had anticipated indifference, but this validation was overwhelming. "I should let you rest, Mr. William," she said, attempting to conclude an encounter that was becoming dangerously intimate. "It is nearly midnight, and I must depart early in the morning." She turned toward the rear staircase that led to her small staff apartment at the back of the estate. She could feel his dark eyes following her, but she did not look back. She hurried up the stairs, closing her door behind her, before letting out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. She sat on the edge of her small bed as the tears fell freely, feeling entirely exposed, yet strangely lighter, for having shared the secret. Downstairs, William remained in the darkened corridor, staring at the empty staircase. The words she had spoken had planted a sudden, disruptive seed in a heart that had long been considered dead. He returned to his massive master bedroom, where the king-sized bed always felt excessively vast for a single occupant, and sat by the window without removing his tailored coat. The distant lights of the town twinkled below, indifferent to the quiet shift occurring within his walls. The hours moved with agonizing slowness as William remained awake in the darkness. He picked up his heavy gold watch, a token from an empire he had backed a century ago, and set it down without glancing at the time. The weight of his centuries felt like a physical shackle tonight, reminding him of everything he possessed and everything he lacked. He recalled the rare occasions he had attended public functions in Denver. He always arrived alone, smiling politely, while dodging polite inquiries about his solitary lifestyle. He had built a financial empire from the shadows, but he inhabited it like a solitary prisoner, surrounded by cold stone and meaningless artifacts. Listening to Juliana's story made him realize that he was trapped in a very similar brand of isolation. They were both performers in their own lives, carrying expectations that kept them isolated. The primary difference was that Juliana possessed a family that loved her fiercely, however flawed their methods, while he had no one. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, unable to remain still, William descended to his private study. He stared at the financial ledgers and real estate portfolios on his desk, but the columns of numbers failed to hold his attention. His mind kept returning to the image of Juliana, weeping into a phone, trying to protect her family at the expense of her own truth. There was a fierce resilience beneath her quiet exterior that moved him deeply. He walked into the kitchen and prepared a pot of black coffee, his movements automatic, while his mind finalized a plan that was entirely out of character for the ruthless vampire king. He was a creature of absolute calculation, yet this decision was entirely human. Juliana required a companion for a single day to satisfy her traditional family and provide comfort to her ailing mother. And he, a sovereign of the night, who had forgotten the meaning of selflessness, could fulfill that role. He had no pressing engagements. His wealth allowed him absolute freedom. He could dress appropriately, drive her to Nebraska, portray the attentive partner for an afternoon, and return to his quiet life without any permanent complications. It was a simple favor between two lonely people. But William knew it ran deeper than that. He needed to feel useful, to matter to another living soul, even if it was within the bounds of a temporary theater. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the tall windows when he heard Juliana descending the rear stairs. She entered the kitchen and stopped abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise at finding him standing there so early. Her eyelids were swollen from lack of sleep, and dark circles shadowed her skin. They exchanged a long, quiet look, filled with the unspoken tension of the previous night. Juliana was the first to break the silence, murmuring a formal greeting as she moved toward the coffee maker, her eyes fixed on the counter. William knew he had to speak before the practical light of day dissolved the strange clarity he had found in the dark. He took a deep breath, stepping toward the kitchen table. "Juliana," he said clearly, his voice steady yet remarkably soft. She turned slowly, her expression defensive, clearly preparing herself for a lecture on professional boundaries. William saw the lingering apprehension in her eyes, and felt a sudden pang of regret for having maintained such a cold, terrifying distance for 3 years. He sat down at the table, an unprecedented action for a man who always took his meals in total isolation, and signaled for her to join him. She remained standing, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "I spent the night thinking about what you shared," William began, maintaining direct eye contact. "About your sister's wedding and the pressure you are facing." Juliana stiffened, her knuckles turning white against the ceramic mug. She was likely regretting her vulnerability, bracing for unsolicited advice. But William merely leaned forward, his expression open. I know exactly what it means to attend significant events alone, while pretending the isolation does not affect you. I have performed that exact script for a very long time. The admission hung in the air, a sudden bridge between their vastly different existences. Juliana looked at him with entirely new eyes, seeing past the expensive fabrics and the cold, pale demeanor of her employer. William pressed forward before his rational mind could talk him out of the proposal. You do not need to beg acquaintances or feel humiliated by your circumstances, he said thoroughly. If you still require a companion for tomorrow, if you still need someone to portray that role, I am offering to go with you. The kitchen fell into an absolute, breathless silence. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to amplify the shock on Juliana's face. Her expression froze in a mixture of disbelief and deep suspicion. She set her mug down with a mechanical movement, her eyes never leaving his pale face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out for several seconds. You, what? She finally whispered, her voice cracking. I can accompany you to Nebraska, William repeated firmly, leaving no room for her to mistake it for a cruel joke. I can portray your companion for the day. Just one afternoon, nothing more. Juliana shook her head slowly, her protective walls immediately rising. I don't understand, she said unsteadily, taking a step away from the table. Why would you do something like that? It makes no sense, Mr. William. You don't know me. I am your employee. We may not know every detail of each other's histories, William countered, rising slowly from his chair to avoid startling her. But I know you have managed this estate with absolute integrity for 3 years. I know you sacrifice your own comfort to sustain your family. I know you are facing a crisis that no one should have to navigate alone. Juliana's eyes filled with moisture, her pride warring directly with her desperation. William took another step forward, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. I expect absolutely nothing in return, Juliana. This is not a contract or a financial transaction. It is a gesture from one isolated soul to another. The raw honesty in his voice broke through her remaining defenses. Juliana let out a ragged breath, tears spilling over her cheeks, as she recognized the complete absence of mockery in his eyes. In that quiet kitchen, illuminated by the pale morning light, the rigid boundary between the ancient king and the human housekeeper dissolved completely. I don't know what to say, she murmured, wiping her face with the back of her hand. You don't have to say anything right now, William replied. Consider the offer. If you accept my assistance, I am prepared to leave when you are. If you prefer to find another alternative, I will understand completely. Juliana stared at him, trying to read the depths of his pale eyes. Why would a man like you care about my family's opinion? Because last night, listening to your distress, I realized something vital, William admitted with a sincerity he hadn't used in centuries. I have spent lifetimes constructing a secure, powerful existence that is entirely devoid of meaning. You reminded me of what it looks like to love people fiercely, even when it is difficult. Perhaps, for just one day, I wish to be part of something that actually matters. Juliana covered her mouth, a small sob escaping her as she realized the offer came from a shared understanding of loneliness. If I accept, she whispered, it is strictly for one day. Afterward, we return to the way things were. We will return to whatever boundaries you require, William promised. Juliana closed her eyes, took 3 deep breaths, and looked directly into his white-haired countenance. All right, she said softly. I accept your help. In the hours that followed, the dynamic within the estate shifted dramatically. They spent the afternoon in the study, ironed out the details of their manufactured relationship, aligning their timelines to ensure the fiction was airtight. Juliana had contacted her sister Clara to confirm she would be arriving with a partner, and the pure excitement in Clara's voice had validated the entire risky endeavor. We need a consistent narrative, William remarked, sitting across from her at the kitchen island while she prepared a light traveling lunch. How did our paths cross in a romantic context? We could say we met through a local historical society or a mutual property project, Juliana suggested, chopping vegetables with practiced precision. You needed someone to catalog local records. We began talking, and it developed naturally over the last 6 months. 6 months is perfect, William agreed. It implies stability without forcing us to invent a massive history of shared holidays. They practiced the subtle mechanics of a public relationship, how he should hold her coat, the appropriate level of physical proximity, the casual terms of endearment. Juliana felt an intense wave of strangeness, practicing these intimacies with the formidable man she had served for years. But William was entirely respectful, constantly checking her comfort levels and maintaining strict boundaries. "My extended family will be intensely curious," Juliana warned him. "Particularly my Aunt Gertrude. She will cross-examine you about your background, your finances, and your intentions. Let her inquire." William smiled faintly. "I will simply offer a modified version of the truth. I am an independent real estate investor. I value my privacy, and I reside in a quiet estate in Silver Ridge. There is no need to overwhelm them with excessive details." Juliana smiled genuinely for the first time in days. "You are remarkably adept at this, William," he corrected her gently. "If we are to convince them, you must drop the formal titles entirely. No Mr. William during the drive or the reception." The name felt heavy, yet strangely sweet on her tongue. "William," she practiced. The following morning, William selected a well-tailored but modest dark suit, deliberately avoiding anything that screamed of excessive, aristocratic wealth. He wanted to project prosperity and reliability without intimidating her humble relatives. Juliana appeared in the hallway wearing a simple, elegant navy blue dress she had purchased with her own savings, declining his offer to fund her wardrobe. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, revealing a natural grace William had never fully appreciated. The journey to the small farming town in Nebraska took just over 5 hours. William drove a standard black SUV from his garage rather than his high-end imports, navigating the winding mountain passes until the terrain smoothed into vast open fields of green and gold. Juliana remained quiet, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap as the state line neared. "What if they see right through us?" she whispered nervously. "They will see exactly what they expect to see," William assured her, his voice projecting a calm confidence he didn't entirely feel. Two adults who care for one another, attending a joyous family milestone. "We only need to maintain the theater for a few hours." As they pulled into the driveway of her childhood home, a modest, well-maintained farmhouse surrounded by ancient oak trees, William felt a sudden surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with danger. It was the primitive fear of human judgment, the desire to be accepted by people who mattered to a woman who was rapidly becoming important to him. "They are going to think you are wonderful," Juliana said softly, sensing his sudden tension. "You are a good man, William. It shows." The farmhouse erupted into immediate activity the moment the vehicle came to a halt. A small army of aunts, cousins, and neighbors emerged, dressed in their Sunday best. The rich scent of homemade pies, roasted meats, and fresh bread hung heavy in the warm afternoon air. Juliana was instantly enveloped in a cascade of emotional embraces and high-pitched welcomes. William stood slightly back, a polite smile fixed on his pale face as he observed the raw display of human affection. A slender woman with silver hair and bright, perceptive eyes separated herself from the crowd and approached him. It was Juliana's mother. Before William could extend a formal hand, the fragile woman stepped forward and pulled him into a warm, surprisingly firm embrace. "Thank you," she whispered directly into his ear. "Thank you for looking after my girl." William found himself entirely speechless. The absolute sincerity of the matriarch, disarming his ancient defenses completely. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile was radiante. "Come inside, both of you. Clara is just finishing her hair. Juliana, your sister is going to lose her mind when she sees who you brought home." Juliana's father appeared moments later, his face lined from decades of manual labor under the sun. He shook William's hand with a powerful, calloused grip, looking him directly in the eye. "Welcome to our home," he said simply, and William felt the profound weight of that simple acceptance. The hour before the ceremony was a whirlwind of introductions. Aunt Gertrude materialized exactly as predicted, launching a barrage of questions regarding his investment portfolios and his long-term plans in Colorado. William navigated the interrogation with flawless patience, providing just enough charm to satisfy her curiosity, while redirection the focus back to the bridal party. He found it remarkably easy to converse with these people. There was an immediate, unvarnished warmth here that he had never encountered in high society. When Clara finally descended the stairs in her simple white gown, her face glowing with absolute happiness, William fully understood why Juliana had spent years sacrificing her own life to preserve this sanctuary. The love within the house was a physical force. "Juliana," Clara cried, throwing her arms around her older sister before turning her bright gaze onto William. "And you must be William. I cannot believe my sister kept a man like you hidden away in the mountains for 6 months." "The pleasure is entirely mine," William said, offering a genuine smile. "I assure you, I am the fortunate one in this arrangement." The ceremony took place in a small, white-steepled church down the road, filled to capacity with local families and wild lilacs. William sat closely next to Juliana in the front pew, his supernatural senses taking in the soft rustle of her dress and the quiet catching of her breath, as Clara walked down the aisle toward her young groom. During the vows, Juliana began to weep silently, tears of profound relief and joy. William instinctively reached into his pocket, retrieved a silk handkerchief, and pressed it into her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, drying her eyes. "Always," he murmured. Their eyes met in the dim, candle-lit sanctuary, and for a fleeting moment, the illusion vanished, replaced by an intensity that felt entirely real. The reception was held in the expansive backyard of the farmhouse, beneath strings of warm fairy lights that flickered against the twilight sky. A local folk band played lively acoustic music, driving the guests onto a temporary wooden dance floor. William, who had not danced in over a century, found himself pulled into the center of the floor by Juliana, their movements synchronized instantly, her warmth radiating against his cold frame. "You are surprisingly light on your feet for a reclusive investor," she teased, her eyes sparkling beneath the lights. "You should never underestimate the benefits of a classical education," he countered, spinning her gently, rewarded by the sound of her genuine laughter. It was during this dance that William truly looked at her. He saw the way she managed the entire evening, quietly adjusting Clara's veil, ensuring her mother had a glass of water, laughing with her cousins, and greeting every elderly neighbor with profound respect. Juliana was a source of pure, unselfish light. Every action she took was born of genuine love, and William wondered how he had lived beside this vibrant soul for 3 years, without ever truly seeing her. The illusion became complicated when the band leader announced a traditional dance for all the couples present, commanding everyone to share a kiss when the music stopped. Juliana looked at William with sudden panic. They had not rehearsed this level of public display. "It is just a brief gesture to satisfy the audience," William whispered as the music slowed to a halt. "Trust me." Juliana nodded, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. The kiss was supposed to be a technical execution, a practiced movement to maintain the fiction. But the moment William's lips touched hers, the universe fell completely silent. The ambient noise of the crowd faded into nothingness. For an eternal second, there was only the warmth of her breath against his skin, a sudden, electric spark that sent a shockwave through his frozen heart. When they parted, Juliana's eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and profound realization. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur for William. He functioned on autopilot, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors and raising his glass during the toasts, but his entire consciousness remained tethered to that singular kiss. Juliana appeared equally altered. She avoided direct eye contact, yet she remained physically close to him, her hand occasionally resting lightly against his arm as they moved through the crowd. As the midnight hour approached and the guests began to depart, Juliana's mother approached William in the quiet garden near the orchard. "May I steal you for a moment, William?" she asked softly. They walked a short distance from the lanterns, the cool night air rustling the apple trees. The elderly woman turned to him, her expression soft. "I have spent years carrying an immense worry for Juliana," she began. "She has always carried the weight of this family on her shoulders, sacrificing her own youth to ensure her sisters were educated and her father's medical bills were paid. She never permitted herself to reach for her own happiness." William listened in silence, a sudden wave of protectiveness washing over him. "But today," her mother continued, a small, knowing smile gracing her lips, "I watched my daughter smile with her entire soul. I saw the way you look at her, William, like a man who knows he has found something priceless. Juliana deserves to be cherished exactly like that. Promise an old woman you will look after her." "I promise you," William said, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. "She will never have to face a storm alone again." When they returned to the house, the family had cleared the dishes, and Clara and her husband had departed for their honeymoon. The farmhouse was quiet. Juliana and William found themselves alone on the back porch, staring out at the vast Nebraska sky, which was thick with millions of visible stars, a sight completely missing from the neon glow of the city. "Thank you," Juliana said quietly, breaking the silence, "for everything you did today. You gave my mother a beautiful piece of peace." "There is no need to thank me," William replied, turning to look at her silhouette against the starlight. "Your mother is an exceptional woman. Now I understand exactly where you inherited your strength. You have carried this family for years, without a single complaint. You are the most resilient person I have ever encountered." Juliana looked up, her eyes shining with tears. "I didn't feel strong today. I felt like a fraud, because during that dance, and during that kiss, I forgot we were performing. I forgot the contract entirely." William stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing. "I felt the exact same shift, Juliana. The theater ended the moment I touched your hand." "William," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you are my employer. I work within your walls. This changes everything." "Only if we allow the old structures to dictate our future," he replied, his pale hand gently rising to brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "We can return to Silver Ridge and pretend this weekend was nothing more than a temporary favor. Or we can discover exactly where this path leads." Before she could answer, her father appeared at the door, holding a lantern. "The front bedroom is prepared for you two. Get some rest. You have a long drive tomorrow." Juliana's face flushed red, but she quietly thanked him as they walked inside. The bedroom was small and intimate, dominated by an old handmade quilt on a double bed. William immediately offered to take the floor with a blanket, but Juliana stopped him. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, her voice dropping to a soft murmur. "We are adults. We can share a space without losing our minds." They changed separately, William returning in a simple black shirt and trousers, while Juliana wore a modest flannel nightgown. They lay down on opposite sides of the mattress, stiff and hyper-aware of the tiny distance between them. "William?" she whispered into the dark. "Yes, Juliana? What my mother said to you in the garden. About the way you look at me. Was that part of the performance?" William remained silent for several long moments, staring at the ceiling. "No," he said honestly. "Today was the first day in a century where I felt entirely alive, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the script. It was entirely because of you." The morning arrived with the sharp scent of brewing coffee and frying bacon. Juliana woke to find her head resting gently against William's shoulder, his arm lightly wrapped around her waist. The absolute security of his presence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the isolation she usually felt. She moved slightly, and his dark eyes opened instantly, filled with a soft warmth that replaced his usual cold stare. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice deep with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, reluctantly rising. "We should prepare for the drive. We promised to return before nightfall." The farewells at the farmhouse were intensely emotional. Her mother held William tightly, repeating her gratitude, while her father offered another firm, respectful nod. The drive back to Colorado was entirely different from the trip out. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was heavy with the weight of mutual realization. "What are you analyzing so intensely?" William asked, keeping his eyes on the mountain highway. "How completely my world has shifted in 48 hours," Juliana admitted, looking out at the passing pine trees. "2 days ago, I was the quiet shadow who cleaned your rooms. Today, I don't know what we are to each other." William smoothly pulled the vehicle into a scenic rest stop, overlooking a deep canyon, shifting the engine into park. He turned in his seat to face her directly. "Juliana, I cannot allow you to continue working as my housekeeper." Her expression crumbled, her skin turning pale. "Are you dismissing me?" "No," William said quickly, reaching out to take her hand. "I am releasing you from the employment because it is impossible for me to view you as a subordinate after this weekend. I cannot watch you maintain my house while ignoring the fact that you have completely upended my existence. I want to know you completely outside the walls of that estate." "William, I require that income to sustain my family," she reminded him, her practical fears resurfacing. "I cannot simply abandon my financial responsibilities." "Your family will remain entirely secure," William insisted firmly. "I am offering to fund a separate residence for you and a full scholarship to pursue the nursing education you mentioned to your sister. I want to offer you the freedom to reach for your own life, while giving me the opportunity to court you properly." Juliana stared at him, her chest rising and falling as she weighed the massive proposition. "It seems incredibly risky. We come from entirely different worlds, William. My past is one of manual labor, and yours is one of immense privilege and hidden histories. Every meaningful connection requires a leap into the unknown," William said softly. "The alternative is returning to our respective isolations, always wondering what might have occurred if we had found our courage." They arrived back at the Silver Ridge estate, as the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long crimson shadows across the stone facade. The grand house looked exactly the same, yet the atmosphere within it had been permanently altered. As they stood in the grand foyer, Juliana picked up her small traveling bag, turning to face him near the base of the stone staircase. "I need a short amount of time to process all of this," she said honestly. "Take all the time you require," William smiled, stepping forward to press a gentle, lingering kiss against her forehead. "I have waited centuries for something real. I can certainly wait a few days for you." Over the next 2 weeks, an elegant compromise was established. Juliana transitioned out of her domestic duties, moving into a charming, light-filled cottage near the town center, funded entirely by an independent educational trust William had established for her. She began preparing for her nursing entrance examinations, her kitchen counter covered in textbooks and anatomical charts. William visited her every evening, no longer as an imposing master, but as a guest seeking her company. They spent hours sitting on her small porch, drinking tea and sharing details of their lives that had been hidden during her 3 years of service. William shared stories of old Europe, of architectures long demolished, while Juliana spoke of Nebraska blizzards and the simple joys of her childhood. "You are remarkably human for someone with your specific background," Juliana noted one evening, watching him methodically help her organize her study notes. "Wealth and time can freeze a soul," William replied, looking up at her with his dark, expressive eyes. "But they cannot entirely destroy the desire to matter to someone. You thawed a mechanism that had been frozen for a very long time." Their first public challenge emerged when William was required to attend a high-profile charity gala in Denver, an event attended by the region's political and financial elite. He formally invited her as his companion, and Juliana immediately experienced a wave of intense insecurity. "I don't belong in those grand ballrooms, William," she whispered, looking at the formal invitation. "The moment anyone inquires about my background, they will discover I was the woman who maintained your estate. They will discover exactly what I choose to tell them," William countered gently, taking her hands in his. "They will see Juliana, an independent nursing student, and the woman who holds my absolute respect. Your past labor is a testament to your integrity, not a source of shame." The evening of the gala was a triumph of quiet elegance. Dressed in a classic emerald gown, Juliana carried herself with a natural dignity that outshone the manufactured charm of the aristocrats. William introduced her simply as his partner, his pale features radiating a pride that left no room for whispered rumors. When an old associate inquired about her lineage, William simply stated that her family held the deepest roots in the American heartland, a truth that silenced any further snobbery. As they drove back to Silver Ridge beneath a blanket of falling snow, Juliana reached across the console and interlaced her fingers with his. "Thank you for showing me that I do not need to hide my past to deserve a place in your future." 3 months after Clara's wedding, Juliana received word from Nebraska that her mother had passed away quietly in her sleep, entirely at peace and surrounded by her family. Juliana traveled back for the funeral, and this time William stood openly by her side, an anchor of pale strength against the bleak winter landscape. Her father welcomed him with a silent embrace, recognizing that the promise made in the orchard was being kept entirely. Returning to Colorado in the early spring, Juliana stood with William on the grand balcony of his estate. The mountain snows were melting, revealing the fresh, vibrant green of the valley below. The vast mansion no longer felt like a cold, hollow tomb. It had become a space of shared quietude, filled with the warmth of an authentic partnership. Looking out over the sprawling landscape, Juliana leaned against his shoulder, her heart completely settled. The future stretching before them was no longer an intimidating expanse of centuries or an endless cycle of financial survival. It was a blank canvas they had chosen to paint together, proving that the most profound transformations often begin with an unexpected conversation overheard in the dark, and that true sanctuary is never found in stone or gold, but in the fierce, unvarnished courage to love and be loved in return.